Okay, I want to talk today about The Vegetarian. The Vegetarian is a book by Han Kang. Han Kang is a Korean author, and earlier this week I asked my aunt what Korean people thought of Han Kang. I guess for some context, I'm Korean but I live in America, so I don't know much about how Han Kang is perceived in Korea. And of course, she said that Han Kang is very respected because she won the Nobel Prize and people are very proud of her. But it's sort of a weird situation because usually, when a Korean person wins something of such a claim, they are very, very honored, and everyone loves them. And the interesting thing is, people still don't like Han Kang's work, and I can definitely see why. The reason is because it's so brutal, and this sort of brings me to a question that I always have about books that are sort of brutal in the sense. The question is, what makes I don't know if this is the right way to say it, but what makes trauma valuable, and what makes it not, right? Because of course there are many cases where trauma is given just for the sake of trauma, and I absolutely detest those books. I detest those movies. Things like A Little Life by Han Kang. I think that is trauma for just the sake of trauma, and therefore I hated that book. I think of Old Boy, the movie, which I also hated, and the reason is because there is no meaningful reconciliation of any characters. There is no derivation of meaning or anything at all from any of these stories. Now, something like Beloved by Toni Morrison is an example of how something traumatic can be used as a device, perhaps as exaggeration, though it's based on a true story, to explain something more. Same with Cormac McCarthy's Blood and Radium, which I think is sort of closer to the line of a bit too traumatic. But both of those books say more than just trauma. Now, The Vegetarian by Han Kang, a book I recently read, is very similar to both sides, which is interesting to me because when I first started reading this book, I didn't like it at all. I thought it was actually quite boring. And then when I got to the end, I put the book down after I finished and I realized that I had really enjoyed this book, which seems almost disgusting to say. I feel disgusted to say that I enjoyed the book because of what happens inside of it. So I guess I sort of want to make a video to explain the book a bit, perhaps for some of you who have read it already, who want to read it, or are reading it currently, to perhaps make some sense of what's going on, because it's very difficult to kind of make sense of what happened in a meaningful way. And it is in my opinion that meaning can be derived from this book, and therefore it is not a book which is so bad in my opinion because there's something more. So the basic premise of the book is Young-hye is the main character. She has been abused by her father. She has been treated as an object by her father, and when she's been married, she is in addition treated as an object by him. And this goes farther than just, oh, I need food on the table when I get home or whatever. He forces her into sex. He constantly degrades her. He, of course, wants his meals at specific times and wants them cooked in specific ways, and he never once thinks of her opinion or her feelings or anything like that. So her whole life, she has been controlled by these men. First, her extremely abusive father, and second, her not as physically abusive, but verbally abusive, mentally abusive in the sense that he's a stranger to her. Like in their house, he's a stranger. He's simply demanding of her as a servant, which is very disillusioning to someone who would maybe go into marriage to hopefully escape how she had been mistreated in the past by her father. I mean, that's not really said in the book, but that's my opinion. She wanted to escape from her father marriage. Maybe she hoped that it would bring her some freedom, but it does just the opposite. So she is very, very disillusioned. She has an older sister named In-hye, and In-hye is, as an older sister, she has more power than her. She is supposed to be referred to with respect by her sister, and she is married to an artist who is Young-hye's brother-in-law. So when I say husband, that is Young-hye, the main character's husband. When I say brother-in-law, that is Young-hye's brother-in-law, who is in turn In-hye's, which is Young-hye's older sister's husband. And when I say In-hye, of course, that's her older sister. And Young-hye is a character. Remember that. Now, I know I was talking about the premise, so to get to that, One day, Young-hye becomes vegetarian. The reason is because she had a dream, which I'll explain later. But she had a dream and she becomes vegetarian. There's a very descriptive scene of her husband walking in the kitchen and seeing all of the meat, because oftentimes Korean people buy a lot of meat and just keep it in a separate fridge, like they have multiple fridges in their house sometimes. And she has all the meat just piled on the ground, like hundreds and hundreds of dollars worth of it, piled on the ground, like food that could last for weeks and months between the two of them. And it's just all out there, and she's throwing it away. And it's like, what are you doing? This is the middle of the night. It's like she's sleepwalking, and she just says, "Oh, I had a dream." And the next day, she cooks food, and then there's no meat in it, right? She never eats it. There's a part where her and her husband go to her husband's work, not her work, not his work, but work dinner, and she doesn't eat meat there, and it sort of reflects badly on the husband. And in turn, the husband thinks that she is a bad person, which of course is not fair because she just wants him free. So before we sort of get more into the plot, I first want to address that hopefully I don't spoil the book. I might, but I'll try to keep it so that whoever's watching this video, if you want to read the book or are currently reading the book, you can sort of use this to maybe decide to read it or supplement your reading or sort of make sense of what's going on. And what I will say though is that this book is one of those books where if it does get spoiled, it doesn't really change. I don't know if enjoyment is the right word, but it doesn't really change what you get out of the book, because this book is a lot more about consciousness and about the meaning between the lines than about the plot. And therefore, even if you know the plot, there's still so much more you can derive from this book. So Han Kang's work centers heavily around bodies and the separation of mind and body, which is a debate as old as time. Right? The ancient Greeks talked about this, French existentialists, modern authors, everywhere, everyone has talked about this. And just in short, it's a question of how does our mind and body separate? What is the extent to which changes in our body and changes in our mind can affect the other? Something that is interesting to me, a way of thinking about the mind and body, is of the body as an elephant and the mind as a rider, the elephant rider. So perhaps sometimes your mind wants you to get up and do something productive, like wash the dishes or something, but then your body is still laying in bed and it doesn't let you. Oftentimes there are different levels of processing for making decisions or motivations, and these can often be thought of as sort of, the mind and body. Mind being the higher level, rational being type of thinking, and then the body being, of course, the physical body, but more than that, the very simple motivations of an animal or of a biological being. Okay? So, in The Vegetarian, Young-hye goes crazy. That's very clear. And the reason is because her whole past has been dictated by the abuse of other men, and therefore she has no power. And when she has no power, she wants to find it. The thing is, there is nothing in her life that is not controlled by another man. Every waking moment of hers is... sorry, I don't know if my camera's on. Every waking moment of hers is for the sole purpose of serving her husband or her father. When it was her father, it was because he would constantly abuse her. And when it was her husband, it's because even when she wants to use the bathroom or eat or anything, it has to be at a time which doesn't affect him or after she's made food for him or something like that. Therefore, the only freedom she has is in her dreams, which is why she says, "Oh, I had a dream." That's her only justification for becoming a vegetarian. Because when there's no meaning in the real world, one seeks meaning out latently. Latently meaning like Freud, like a meaning that is between the lines, something like a dream, right? Like dream interpretation, which of course scientifically doesn't mean anything, but latently, or in terms of just the ideas generated from life experiences, dreams can be a valuable way of processing. And that is psychologically backed up by evidence. Some people think that dreams are a way of processing the daily events of the information because there are centers in our brain like the hippocampus or memory processing areas that are very active during dreaming. Some scientists think dreaming is like a way of filing memories away, sort of like in a file cabinet, or storing them or organizing them or something like that. And of course, I'm not currently caught up with all the psychological research, But that is just to say that dreams can be important, and dreams can have a lot of meaning. The person who discovered benzene, that is the six carbon ring structure that is found in a lot of chemical compounds in the body and around the world, was discovered because the chemist who discovered it, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is as far as I know, the chemist who discovered it had a dream about the Ouroboros, which is the snake with the tail in its mouth. And he woke up one day and he was like, oh my gosh, it's benzene. The benzene, it's a ring. And you can sort of see how meaning can come from dreams, right? Humans have not always been able to speak, but they've always been able to dream, right? Meaning can also come from things like music. If you think about The Awakening by Kate Chopin, right? The music is a very powerful device which helps Edna, the character in The Awakening, discover what freedom really means. In the same way, in The Vegetarian, dreams help Jung understand what freedom really means. And in this case, it's devastating to her because she realizes that she's never had freedom. It's something she's always known. But to finally face that fact head on causes her to do something as drastic as become a vegetarian. The vegetarian is a means of control. It's a way to control her life. And again, happiness, or not again, I never said this, but happiness often comes from control. And this is also backed up by scientific literature, and again, correct me if I'm wrong because I'm not constantly studying this, but that's why money makes people happier to a certain extent, right? That's why you like to be comfortable, because people like to have control. The more control people have, generally the more happy they are. Okay. Another thing I want to address is the narration of this book. So, again, the sort of three narrators are her husband, her brother-in-law, and her sister. These are all people who are in high positions of power than her, especially in Korean culture, which is quite based on like a hierarchical situation of families and things like that. And therefore, all sections of this book take a sort of condescending kind of feeling to them, because you can see that all these people expect to be respected by her. They expect respect from Younghae to them, which means that they themselves can get away with something. Now, I read the English translation because my Korean is not that good, but I think in Korean this is even more impactful because there is a very rigorous formality in Korean language, and the absence of that, which I'm assuming is the case for these three people who are older and more socially higher than her. These people would not use honorifics in their language, which of course would be quite impactful, and I think that's something that might have lost itself in the translation. Of course, I haven't read the Korean translation, so I can't really speak to that. This is just a guessing line. Now, that is very important because there are many parts of this book which make Younghae seem like an absolute fool. And even the premise of this book, if you just hear the plot of this woman who just becomes a vegetarian because of a dream, it's pretty easy to just think, that this is just some crazy woman. And of course, she probably is a little crazy. And towards the end of the book, you'll see what I mean. But that doesn't mean that, that shouldn't discount the gravity of the actions of the narrators. The narrators are all, except maybe her sister, quite bad people. And that is pretty much undoubtable. They do some pretty disgusting things, which I will not get into. One, because I don't want to spoil anything, but two, I just don't want to talk about them. It's bad stuff. And look up some trigger warnings for this book if you are so inclined before you read it, because you should be aware of what happens. This world doesn't. Yeah, so it's pretty easy to read this book and to sort of think of Younghae as a kind of crazy woman. And that is, I think, the danger of writing all three sections from people more powerful than her. But I think that's also a very powerful device, because when these parts of the book are written in the first person, it sort of projects these people onto the reader. So as a reader, you sort of start like rooting for the person narrating, right? It's like when you move to a new city and you start rooting for the sports team in the area, of course, unless you were rivals at that beforehand. But the situation you're in dictates who side you choose. And when it's the narrator, the person closest to you, is the first person, it's very easy to side with them. And in that regard, it's very easy to discount the emotions of the main character. And I think that's something that you should keep in mind while you read this. This is why I said that you might be fine with spoilers, because this book has a lot of meaning between the lines. There's a lot of meaning that can be found from an unreliable narrator, which I really enjoy. I really enjoy reading books like these because I'm able to see two different meanings, or more than just one meaning, from every bit of text, because, of course, there is what actually happens. Sure, does at face value what happens, but at the same time, there's this question that, like, well, why is this person telling the story? Right? Some books will actually have it like a denouement where at the end of the book it's like, oh, I was actually writing this book this whole time, and it's like this whole first person, not plot twist, but it's like, oh, that's cool kind of moment. And sometimes it's just first person for the sake of first person, and there's no acknowledgement of the narrator writing this on their own time or anything like that. Sort of just an explanation of what happened from their perspective. But that still doesn't mean that there is some feeling of trying to avoid certain topics from them, or trying to gloss things over and emphasize some other things, right? It's like writing a resume, right? You're going to sort of gloss over some things, and on other things you're going to raise up. It's the same thing for first person narration. So that should be something that you keep in mind. Now, I don't want to get too much into the second section, but I do want to talk a bit about her in-law, her brother-in-law. So her brother-in-law is married to Young-hae's older sister, In-hae. And In-hae is a very accomplished woman. She is a breadwinner of the family. She takes great care of her child. She is a great cook. She seems, I don't know if she's social, I can't remember that part, but she seems like she has a good life. And her husband, his brother-in-law, is a very insecure man because he wants to be an artist, but he's never been very successful. And artists are very insecure people because they always want to be great, right? There's not a lot of room at the top, which means that artists are very competitive, and that means that they're very insecure about themselves because they know that they might not be enough. So that, combined with his emasculation, her brother-in-law's sort of emasculated because his wife is a breadwinner, his wife does so much more than him. He has a conviction to do something great. He's putting it all into art. He goes out and he comes home late, but it's not because he's making money, it's because he's trying to make art. And I don't want to say that money is gaining, right? Like, you can still, oftentimes more meaning is generated from art, and a much more fulfilling life is generated from art. But when art is done in the pursuit of just greatness, or just of some sort of treatment for an insecurity, it is just like when a book is just trauma for the sake of trauma. There is no good end goal. And even when a perceived end goal is approached and reached, there's just going to be another one. Therefore, no happiness can come from this, no meaning can come from a search of greatness for just a search of greatness and the appeal of the approval of other people. So that is the character analysis of him. Now, not to get too far into what he does, but he essentially wants to photograph people naked. He thinks this is the next big breakthrough in art. And then what you should realize is that obviously a person who's clothed is automatically in a position of more power than someone who is naked. Therefore, he just wants power. Now, the first two parts are very hard to read. There's a lot of abuse and very horrible things, which is why the first two sections, I didn't like the book at all. But I read the last section, and the last section is told from the perspective of In-hae, the older sister of the main character. Now, after reading this, it sort of reconciled everything that had come before, not in the sense that, oh, it's okay, oh, it's just part of the story kind of feeling, but like there's a meaning that can be pulled from these things. Like it's disgusting, but in a way to provide further explanation for what's going on, in the same way that satire or hyperbole can be used to enlighten people about what's actually happening. Right? These are exaggerations, but just because they're exaggerations doesn't mean that they hold some bit of truth. And oftentimes, these exaggerations are necessary to get people's attention. Or in this case, a term like this is important to understand the structural underpinnings of a patriarchal society, and how this can dictate the very life and very sanity of someone. And in addition to this, what in his section does really well is talk about fragility, life's fragility. So, what I mean by fragility is that life is extremely fragile. Things can change at any moment. Every time you get in a car, every time you cross the street, right? That's just one example. Anything can happen, and that can completely change the trajectory of your life. Now, something that really struck out to me was in his very lucid interpretation and understanding of why her sister Young-hae ended up this way. At this point, she's in a mental hospital. I won't go further than that because I don't want to spoil it, but she's in the mental hospital, and she says that the older sister, Young-hae, says that she always thought that she was a great older sister because she was so independent. She would always go out. But what she realized that means that she would leave Young-hae and his father, their father, alone together, which would mean that all his father would do is abuse her. And since they are related by blood, that means that the genetics are very similar. That means that one of their dispositions towards mental illness is very similar to the other person's disposition. And what comes from this is that at this point it very well might be just environmental factors which dictate who is crazy and who is not, who has to face mental barriers and who isn't. So then she feels a sort of survivor's guilt because she realizes that she might be at fault for causing Young-hae to end up this way. Because she would just leave her behind. This could have been her if she was left behind too, because in the same environment, with the same dispositions, genetic dispositions to a mental health challenges, whatever you want to call it, then this very well could have been her. In addition to this, her life has been uprooted. Her husband has cheated on her in the most despicable manner. Her son has been sick for a long time, such that she has not been able to sleep except for 1 hour at a time here and there. Which, if you know anything about sleep deprivation, which I'm sure all of you have stayed up too late, you know how that feels. And if you multiply that by 100, that's how Young-hae feels in this section. Her son, her only son, who she has to take care of alone, has an incredible fever, but she has to go and take care of her sister in a mental hospital. So she has to go and leave her child behind with someone else to go help someone else, to go help her sister. So she leaves her son behind and go help her sister. And she has to live a much worse life than she did because she's unable to sleep in this way. She used to have a nice job, and I think she's still working at this point. I don't really remember, but she seemed to be doing okay for herself before all these events happened. Now suddenly it's all ripped away. There's this very fragile feeling to everything. It's very touching in some ways to see her fighting through life so much, but at the same time, sometimes it's hard to feel sorry for her because she seems bitter. She seems, I don't know if ungrateful is the right word, maybe unfaithful, not in the sense that she doesn't believe in religion or anything, that's not really pertinent to the book, but rather that she seems like she doesn't really have an appreciation for her own life or something that maybe another person might expect her to have, or like thankfulness or gratitude or anything, all these qualities which we think are good, and I think so that they are good too, but any of these qualities which we think make a meaningful life, she doesn't really have any of those, so it's not necessarily easy to feel super sorry for her. Yeah, like one bad thing can happen, and that can spiral to all aspects of her life. In addition to this, her poor sleep cycle can cause further problems. Now, there's a theme of vicious cycles in the story. For example, the dog getting dragged around in the cycle, which if you read, you'll understand. If not, I'll leave for you to read it. The cycle of violence, the cycle of not being able to sleep, making a mistake, and then having to stay awake fixing that mistake, or just the cycle of not being able to sleep over and over. And this section really transcends from just Young-hae because there's a lot of a lot of talking about Young-hae from her narrative perspective. And that is because this section really dives into the consequences and the full reaches of life and the events which stack on each other until you ask yourself these questions: have I done something wrong? Which comes at the end of section 1. Or, when did all this begin? No, when did it all begin to fall apart? which is at the beginning of section 3. This feeling that something's wrong, but when did it all go wrong? Was there a time when I could have done something to change it? It's because life is so fragile. It's because it cascades and ripples like so fast. Everything happens so fast that you can't keep track of it all. And especially when you're alone, especially when you have no one except your younger son, it's even harder. So I think this kind of gets into absurdism. I think this section really gets into existentialism and the feeling of unease with life and the fragility of life and the kind of way that one must face the extent of life. So I'll be talking about it next. Now my camera's about to run out of battery, so I'm gonna go change the batteries and then I'll be back. Camus' interpretation of absurdism is a peaceful one. It's a mere acceptance of the fact that the world is just indifferent, and that is what it is. Indifference in a benign sense, indifference in the sense that things might happen to you, like if you think about naturalism, or if that's the right word, that, you know, like you can go out in the tundra and the snow, or in a tsunami and just be caught up in the tsunami no matter how much technology you have. At the end of the day, nature is more powerful than you. And that's a very indifferent sort of feeling. Like the world doesn't really care about what humans are walking across it. Rain is still going to fall, waves are still going to crash, you know, natural disasters are still going to happen. So that means that the world is indifferent to humanity, right? Insofar as if man asked the world to not rain on this day, it's still going to rain. At least currently. Maybe it can change. I know there's people like seed clouds and things like that. But the idea is that one is always under the world's control. And maybe not even the natural world, but one is always under the control to the extent that something unexpected might happen. For example, every time someone gets in a car, they are under the control of the very small possibility, hopefully small possibility, that there might be an accident. And you can see that as a world. That's not just nature, it's everything. So that's Camus' interpretation of absurdism. It's sort of a peaceful one, but it just talks about indifference. It's not the world wants to kill you, that the world is evil, or, you know, like the world is not what it really is. Things just happen that are out of your control. And from that, things can spiral, and they can hide themselves in your mind until there's no emotion. And the feeling of absurdity can come from that. So a very impactful quote from Camus to me, a quote that was written by Camus that was very impactful to me, was from The Stranger. And the quote goes, "To feel it so like myself, indeed, so brotherly, made me realize that I'd been happy, that I was happy still, for all to be accomplished, for me to feel less lonely. All that remained to hope was that on the day of my execution, there should be a huge crowd of spectators, and that they should greet me with howls of execration." Now, what is this saying? This is saying that this character was happy despite the benign indifference of the universe, despite the fact that things don't affect him really. And therefore, because they're out of his control, therefore, what else to do than to just be happy? The quote before that, or the section before that said, "It was as if that great rush of anger had washed me clean, emptied me of hope, and gazing up at the dark sky, spangled with its signs and stars for the first time, I laid my heart open to the benign indifference of the universe." That great anger which washed him clean, there's that realization that maybe one is out of control. Maybe life is so fragile that anything can happen. But why not be happy about it? Now, I don't know if this is a rigorous philosophy that could be used in real life, right? Like, Camus was no Immanuel Kant. But that doesn't mean that something could be learned from this. At the very least, just a feeling of positivity, right? You know, maybe you've heard that if you just smile, you'll automatically feel happier. It's sort of the idea that you still have some control over yourself. And this is a very positive, very humanistic kind of understanding. And this sort of diverges from everything that was in The Vegetarian. But I want to bring this up because I think this is the kind of existentialism that I resonate with. Camus' sort of positive sense of existentialism, right? You think of the myth of Sisyphus, which I'm sure everyone knows at this point. It says that this guy who's rolling up a rock over and over with no end is still happy because that's just what life is. So I really like that. So the idea of washing oneself clean through absurdism is an interesting take, right? Because it alleviates nearly all suffering, and though it doesn't necessarily discount suffering, it provides an uncanny optimism to a world which was otherwise uncaring. How should one ascribe happiness to the act of living if the world itself is indifferent? Right? Shouldn't our outlook on life just be indifferent too? Some sort of uncaring middle ground between optimism and pessimism. How must we assume that life is good? Right? So this sort of gets into nihilism, and I think it's a very important distinction to make, that existentialism is not nihilism. Nihilism is like giving up. Nihilism is like finding nirvana and thinking it's the best man ever. No, I'm just joking. Like nihilism is a very simple philosophy that is not rigorous, that is not valuable. And even though the idea that the world has no meaning may be true, that doesn't mean that something can still be garnered from life experiences, and that happiness can still not be a goal that one can achieve. Right? Nihilism is, in my opinion, a very weak, and even if it were to be strong, it is still a bad philosophy. And I know that's not a good argument, but nothing really good comes from it, right? Like, you're just going to be unhappy, right? And maybe it's just because I want to be positive, maybe it's just because I like the existentialism of Camus. But the question still stands, like, how must we assume that things can be good? How must we be able to be happy about things? And this goes back to the character of Inye. When she's going through so much, how can she still try to find happiness? How can Yonghae still try to find happiness after all she's been through? Because in this section of the book, she seems somewhat content. I don't want to say fully happy, but maybe she's just gone too far, like her mind's not too crazy, but it seems like something's there. And that's really what I want to get from this book. I really want this book to be something that has a valuable and happy meaning, I think, for me. I want to feel good when I read this, after I read this, and maybe this is just my interpretation, which is biased from that desire, but all interpretation of all books is biased, so I would like to give at least my opinion. So I don't know entirely how to answer the question that how must we assume that life is good, but I can say that this quote from the stranger, which I said, was incredibly powerful to me, because there is a way to find optimism in the benign, and it is just the choice of doing so. It told me that there was hope everywhere if one just looked to find it. This completely directed my taste in literature and reading. This completely directed my hopes for life, because I wished for a life in which I could find happiness in anything. That even if such horrible things happened to me, and the life that I knew were to be ripped away by an indifferent universe through my life's fragility, that idea that I would still be happy, and happy still, and that even facing death, that I would look at myself and be content with the life I lived. That I still hold in my outlook on life, the desire that I should look at myself, and after every conversation, every book I read, everything I write, every path I walk on, after every action, everything I do, that I should look back on myself and realize that if I were to die at this very moment, because it very well could happen, that I would be happy. The outlook that I was gifted, life itself, that life is a gift, that it is the purest gift of them all, that my duty is to make the most of the gift that I was given upon my birth in this world which has offered itself to me, and given me a part of itself, and that even the atoms which make up my soul and my body are all a gift, that they should constitute a thankfulness to the universe, that I don't matter at all. Because if the universe is indifferent, why would it create a being like me? Why would it create a being like you? What that means is that your impact on the world is negligible. And this is not nihilism, this is existentialism. This is a feeling of positivity, of happiness. It's because you never do much in the scale of the universe, but that is a comforting feeling, because it means that from that you can still find happiness. Knowing that you don't matter allows you to live a life, a modest life, where you can be happy without taking too much, where you can take just what you need, just have enough control to be content, and to make that decision in your mind. Because otherwise, you will search for something that doesn't exist. And when you search for something that doesn't exist, like the happiness which comes from having a lot of money, or eating a lot of food, or being very popular, or things like that, you'll never be happy. You'll always chase those things. Your life will be ripped away from you and given instead to the desire for something. It'll be an endless loop of desire. So I had to restart this recording because I kind of lost track of what I was saying, but I know I left off when I was talking about what it means for the universe to be indifferent and to still be able to find happiness through that. But the vegetarian provides a very interesting take, I guess, of another way of interpreting absurdism in a way that is still meaningful, in a way that is not just nihilism and giving up. Because a vegetarian also looks for the escape of expectations, for the ability to find meaning in oneself, right? And you can kind of see this at the end where one really diverges completely from what a human should do. Like not even like a societal expectation, but just of a biological expectation of what human must do to survive. She kind of diverges from that. And that is very interesting because it is a way of also looking for freedom, also of escaping expectations. So the vegetarian is sort of powerful to me because it takes what I had initially thought, that existentialism and looking for happiness and whatever the meaning of life is, what that kind of should be, and it kind of took that and it said, but it can also end up this way, using the same reasoning that you have used. Because the vegetarian looks into how someone cannot be happy even when faced with an absurd situation. It shows how things can be ripped away from life and from self so immediately. And it shows that there isn't much hope, but also not much hatred, no execration, like the quote from The Stranger. It's just a simple expunging of the being found in young his soul as it was crushed to oblivion. Has she found happiness? We don't know. We don't know what happens to her. But we do know that something drove her, and that is the search for freedom. The search for freedom drove her to this stage. And it drove her to leave behind the violence which constituted her being. This is the absurdism which I described, the feeling of even the atoms inside of you being a gift. But in this way, it's the feeling of the atoms and the blood inside you of not a gift, but of something that you've stolen. And when I thought of it that way, I thought to myself that makes a lot of sense. Because there's a very high likelihood that perhaps the world will be a better place with less people in it. This is just the tragedy of the common, right? If you have too many people looking for the same thing, then everyone's going to suffer. So what if life is not something that you have been gifted, something that you have stolen? And that feeling is very interesting to me because it runs exactly with quote-unquote life philosophy that I've made for myself. You see, it's a feeling that you don't deserve your body. Right? And it's a feeling that, well, the world's also been telling me that the whole time. So not only do I not have to reject the world through this abstracted sense of like optimistic absurdism, but it's the feeling that the world is also right because it's telling you that you don't deserve what you have. It's maybe why young man was treated this way, which I know is completely unfair to say, but as an abstraction of the contents of this book, this idea that what you have is taken. So from this, it's hard for me to find some sort of meaningful conclusion. I know that books generally speak to me when there's a meaningful reconciliation with the characters or the narrative of the story, or if it says something interesting or something like that. What this book has done is essentially told me that everything that I've thought about is just one-sided. I've only been looking at it from one way. But that offers a perspective which is negative. So it leaves me with a question. Should I think of my life as something stolen, as something that I shouldn't have? And does it mean that every action that I take feeds into the indifference of the universe, but in a negative way? So I'm not sure. I think it's still important to think of the universe as indifferent. And from that, gather that, at the very least, what you do doesn't have a big effect. But that is very dangerous, because you can use that as reasoning to do anything bad. You can just say, oh, it doesn't really do anything, because every being is just part of this indifferent life, which really goes nowhere. So I'm sort of a bit confused. But what I will finally say is the last part of the book. This is a quote which I will read, so skip 30 seconds or something if you don't want to hear this. But here it goes. Then Inge opens her mouth. What I'm trying to say, she whispers to Young. The ambulance chassis rattles over a hollow in the road. Inge squeezes Young's shoulders. Perhaps this is all a kind of dream. She bows her head. But then, as though suddenly struck by something, she brings her mouth right up to Young's ear and carries on speaking, forming the words carefully, one by one. I have dreams too, you know. Dreams, and I could let myself dissolve into them, let them take me over. But surely the dream isn't all there is. We have to wake up at some point, don't we? Because then, she raises her head again. So, is life just a dream though? Is it going nowhere, so when you wake up, the dream itself was indifferent because it has no effect?